Tremor has always been the weird, neglected middle child of Limbus statuses, being overshadowed by every status that deals actual damage, and also lacking the ease of use of something like Poise or Charge. And yet, unlike a neglected middle child, Tremor actually has a lot of support, like a lot of IDs and ego that synergize with it. But even with all of that combined, is Tremor good? Well, the short answer is kind of, yeah. The long answer is, well, the rest of this video. So, join me as I go through the 21 IDs that interact with Tremor or Tremor Burst in some fashion, and the 19 ego along the way as well. Do you get why I put this off for so long? I'll be going through these IDs and ego in order of importance, roughly, since there's a pretty big gap between actually viable Tremor ego and IDs, and this group I like to call the Tremor Bursters. Let's save some time for the first time in my life and get past all of these ego that just burst Tremor for, no real reason. Dawn's Fluid Sac, both Pursuances, Capote Ishmael on Corrosion specifically, Rhyme Shank, Holiday Outis, and Sunshower Outis. All of these basically have Tremor Bursts slapped onto their ego, either just to fill out a line to make it seem less empty, or because the animation really does look like it should burst someone's Tremor, whatever that actually means. Regardless, these ego are generally irrelevant for our purposes, but are, I guess, somewhat nice to keep in mind in case you want a reliable source of Tremor Bursts, even if literally every sinner mentioned here does have a better ego option for that purpose. Yes, there's that many Tremor ego in the game. However, we aren't done with the absolutely useless Tremor Bursters, in case you thought it was just egos. Sunshower Heathcliff, for some reason, has a Tremor Burst specifically on Tails hit of his 4th coin on his 2nd skill. Unlike every ego I mentioned, this is entirely worthless because while egos can be used on any actually relevant ID, Suncliff is Suncliff. Though there's no use crying over spilled hobos, so let's talk about Self-Tremor instead. Specifically, just Spicebush Yisang for right now, because if I didn't include him in this video, some smartass in the comments would have just adored typing about how he's technically Tremor because he has it in his kit, but it's just Self-Tremor. I'm sure everyone thinks you're very smart and very clever for pointing that out, and you definitely have a good relationship with your parents. Outside of Spicebush Yisang's different flavor of charge, he literally has nothing else Tremor related at all, so we swiftly can move on to the actually decent stuff and the actual bulk of the video. Real quick, I mean, no one really mind if I just, you know. Don't use Sloshmael for Tremor. Just don't. When talking about decent Tremor IDs, there's a wide spread of them. And kicking it off is another Ishmael ID since, yeah, she has 4 Tremor IDs total, the most a single sinner has so far, though Molar Ishmael is another one that feels like it should be a self-Tremor technicality. However, she does actually inflict Tremor count on her skill 2, and her passive, which is a big reason why she is so good, relies on Tremor being on the opponent to even activate. If any other syncing ID worked this way, being a light hybrid ID of sorts, then maybe you could see a team working with her, but as it stands, she's generally better left fulfilling that conditional by herself, since she almost entirely maintains Tremor count across her skills, though I'm sure I'll talk more about this in the syncing video, which will likely be out before next Chinese New Year, but I can't even promise you that much. What I can promise you is that I will get my like and subscribe shill out of the way really quickly, and then move on to talk about the ring IDs, who are in an interesting position. Since, kind of like Molar Ishmael, they benefit from being in a Tremor team, though not because they help with Tremor payoff itself. In short, the ring IDs like debuffs, and Tremor is generally an easy debuff to keep up. But all of their Tremor application is RNG reliant, so it's not unreasonable to say that these IDs could go an entire fight without inflicting a single bit of Tremor. The worst part is that Outis and Yisang just have far better options, so running these two in a Tremor team doesn't make sense, but they do count as decent Tremor IDs for probably the weirdest reason out of any other ID I have or will mention. If you want more information on these IDs in particular though, I recommend you watch this video. LCCB Ryoshu is the first of the truly bizarre Tremor IDs that are somehow still firmly rooted in Tremor. I promise, since she's a Poise, SP gain, SP drain, offense level down, rupture ammo, and Tremor ID, who again, is just really weird. Her kit looks completely unrelated to Tremor until you get to the skill 3, which has a very unique conditional, since her Tremor and Rupture application double when she gets a crit on that last coin, which means you are inflicting 8 Tremor potency and 4 Tremor count, as well as getting a free Tremor burst. By all means, 8 Tremor potency and 4 count on one skill is good, but relying on a crit is not good. This gets more embarrassing when you consider a certain coworker does her job, but more than 2 times better than her. The only main advantage Ryoshu has is that she has a shotgun, which, yeah, that's pretty badass, but her slow poise gain and therefore unreliable Tremor support means she's in a low spot for priority. These next 4 IDs are of a pretty similar strength Tremor-wise, those being Oufi Sinclair, Base Ishmael, Base Heathcliff, and Rosespanner Gregor. Now, Oufi Sinclair sucks overall, and I don't want to talk about him, but all I'll say is that his Tremor application is actually okay enough, especially on his skill 2, but if you're going to use a shitty Sinclair 2-star for a Tremor team, you have an objective upgrade available, so don't bother using the literal worst ID in the game, even if his Tremor is not the worst part about him. Base Heathcliff and Base Ishmael are just about the most bog standard Tremor IDs possible, and follow the Tremor ID archetype pretty much to a T, which is that their skill 1 is usually just a small amount of Tremor or Tremor count, the skill 2 is just more Tremor potency, and then the skill 3 is the Tremor burst. It's really nothing special, but it's worth noting that a lot of earlier Tremor IDs don't reduce Tremor count when they burst it, which is a small benefit that's kind of been all but phased out nowadays. And Rose Gregor is another example of this. His Tremor synergy is limited to some extra Rupture on his skill 1, some decent Tremor count on his skill 2, and then the classic skill 3 Tremor burst, which reduces count by 2 in order to inflict Rupture count. Sadly, this is another situation like Molar Ishmael, where Rupture plus Tremor just isn't a real archetype. And no, Sloshmael, you do not count as Rupture Tremor synergy in my eyes, since you have to lose clashes to apply it. What makes Rose Gregor a slightly better Tremor ID in my opinion is access to Leisure Domain, which is a weirdly alright Tremor ego. I know, most people only consider it for this part here, and I don't blame you, but 6 Tremor application and a free Tremor burst with Leisure Domain's cheap resource and SP cost, it's not nothing. Though, of course, in the grand scheme of things, this ego being halfway decent doesn't justify using Rose Gregor for Tremor, especially since, as you'll come to see, Gluttony is not very common on Tremor IDs, meaning you couldn't really use this much to begin with. But if Tremor bursts that reduce your count happens to be your issue, there's 2 IDs that may be able to help you out. Endon is kind of similar to Hong Lu, since while she certainly inflicts Tremor count, it's not very much. But with her passive active, targets that have nails on them are inflicted with +1 Tremor count, which also applies to instances of Tremor at all, meaning her skill 1 is just a free +2 Tremor count with some potency attached as well. A free burst on the skill 2 means she is actually somewhat ahead of the curve, and her skill 3 guarantees +4 Tremor count, which is quite a bit for a single skill. Having access to Wishing Cairn also helps out her viability a little bit, with the main draw being the Tremor potency and Paralyze on the Awakening, but the real funny part is the potential to burst Tremor 3 times on the Corrosion, but that on-crit conditional is probably not happening, so 2 Tremor bursts will have to do, and honestly that's still pretty nice. The core issue with Endon is that she's just not very good, and Wishing Cairn being decent Tremor support doesn't quite save her from that. She's nowhere near the worst. In fact, having a Tremor burst on a skill 2 can be really good, but her rolls don't keep up with most IDs in the game. And while her sustained Tremor count is good, Tremor usually only needs 1 or 2 big bursts of Tremor count before being set for the fight, and in that regard, Molar Sinclair can do very well. He has a similar +2 Tremor count infliction on his skill 1, even if that comes with the absolutely horrible caveat of this rolling a 6 by default. I know I made fun of Endon for having not great rolls, but damn. His skill 2 rolling a 16 with 6 Tremor potency looks like heaven in comparison, even if it's just average in reality, and his skill 3 is weird. This is the only character in the game to have self-tremor and actually interact with it in any meaningful way at all, in the sense that you can expose Sinclair for sucking at his job and having him burst his own tremor if he isn't vibrating enough? Seriously, what's the real-life implication here? He spins out of control or something? I don't know. But if you are at or above 10 self-tremor count, Molar Sinclair's skill 3 will transfer up to 10 of that self-tremor count onto the opponent instead, meaning this is the single best skill for tremor count application in the entire game. Building this up isn't all too bad, just needing 2 skill 2s into a skill 3, but there's another way to play him that could also work, and it has to do with his passive, which allows him to inflict +1 tremor and tremor count with coin effects so long as you are hitting heads. This means the skill 1 becomes a really good tremor skill all of a sudden, inflicting 4 tremor count and some minor potency. The issue is, you can have one, but not the other. By committing to skill 1 spam, your skill 3 is practically a dead skill, and by going for the skill 3 self-tremor transfer, your skill 1 then becomes nearly unusable again. It's an interesting ID design that is kinda held back by tremor count not being all that important anymore, but if you lack some of the better count applying options and happen to have this crab gut covered twink as an available option, then either of these playstyles can do well, though personally I am favorable towards the skill 1 playstyle. Just slightly above the rest of the pack, we have Base Meursault, who is a fascinating case for tremor teams. Like Oufi Sinclair, he sucks. There's no justifying a -3 offense level unless you were to, say, have +2 coin power for free. That's right, we're talking about Regret, which is definitely best known for this line of text here, giving any Meursault +2 coin power and -1 base power for the rest of the fight. But it's doubly relevant because this is also a tremor ego, and it's not too bad in that regard either. This inflicts +3 tremor count, an additional tremor count if you manage to get Absolute Wrath Resonance, good luck with that though, as well as a free tremor burst that deals additional wrath damage if the opponent has no stagger bar left to raise up. Prior to a certain blubbering boy's release into the wild, this was one of the few ways to make tremor bursts actually do something when you've exhausted the stagger thresholds of your enemy. It's not much damage, of course, but it can be something. And if you want to use Base Meursault in any capacity, really, but especially on a tremor team, you'll want to use this ego regardless, meaning a free +3 count and a tremor burst at the very worst. Talking about this passive again though, it's especially good for Base Meursault since all of his attacks are blunt, meaning he benefits from the second line of the passive, granting IDs with less than 4 speed 1 blunt power up, effectively rendering the nerf to base power null. What's even luckier, in a sense, is that Base Meursault literally cannot roll above a 4 on speed since he is terribly slow at that 2 to 3 speed range. While this speed range is kind of annoying to deal with in general fights, it does mean you're almost always going last. And with a skill 2 that bursts Tremor as opposed to the skill 3, you can reliably burst Tremor after every other ID on your team has acted. Why is this relevant? We'll circle back around to it later. But for now, let's talk about average South Korean worker Meursault, or Rose Salt for short. Despite lacking a Tremor Burst on his skill 2 compared to Base Meursault, Rosespanner Meursault doesn't suck by default as a benefit, while gaining a similar-ish benefit from Regret, though his 3 to 8 speed range means the blunt power-up is nowhere near guaranteed. Rose Salt's biggest strength is definitely in his amount of Tremor potency application, applying 4 on his skill 1, 5 on his skill 2, and 6 on his skill 3, which also happens to eat up 3 tremor count for a frankly not good benefit. Raising stagger threshold by an extra amount sounds nice, but on a dedicated tremor team, it's just not needed. And going 3 count negative while giving out no count himself is terrible, especially when you consider his conditionals are based on the amount of tremor count on the opponent. Fun fact, this used to be tremor potency, and therefore it was a lot easier to reach those conditionals, but Project Moon objectively nerfed him by making the description match the actual effect, which is a real shame since 10 plus tremor count is still a little difficult considering the amount of things in this game that love to lower it down. While this seems like the perfect time for a new ID to come on screen with a fancy animation that probably took me over an hour, we aren't done with Meursault. But this time, I want to talk about Liu Meursault, who is a burn ID, and Capote, which is a burn ego. Right? Well, Capote Meursault, as it is written, should inflict tremor potency equal to burn count on the opponent. but it actually inflicts it equal to burn potency, which, as I am sure most people are aware, is really easy to stack up. This means a burn team can quickly end up having a better stack of Tremor than an actual Tremor team. Now, is this intended? It's Project Moon. Yeah, it probably isn't. But it's really funny and not very practical, sadly. Sure, full burn teams will stack up burn quicker than Tremor teams will with Tremor, but trying to mix the two will spread you too thin in either direction. The best usage for this ego, if any, is probably just being used as a free 10 Tremor potency, since the burn potency is inflicted right before Tremor is inflicted equal to the burn potency. Okay, let me rephrase that. This number equal the Tremor. Got that? Alright, I've faffed about for long enough. Who cares about the losers? Let's talk about the real strongest contenders to be on a Tremor team. Here are the IDs we have left. Molar Outis and Outis, Regret Faust, LCCB Ishmael, Rosespanner Rodion, and Oufi Heathcliff. A perfect team of 6 IDs, right? Well, not quite. You see, currently the most important thing for a Tremor team isn't an ID. It's this guy here, Cavernous Wailing Hong Lu. Over the course of this video, you might have noticed that one particularly pretty Chinese man was never brought up before now, because as of making this video, Hong Lu has no Tremor ID. And of course, he basically has to be on a Tremor team simply because this ego is too damn good, and it recontextualizes basically everything else Tremor related because of what it does. Looking at it, this ego deals extra sloth damage, blah blah blah, who cares, extra damage, no one will notice. The important thing is inflicting 3 Tremor count, and triggering amplitude conversion into Tremor reverb. Amplitude conversion is a very simple concept. See all of this normal looking Tremor? Fuck that, I hate it. What if it was purple or red, or in Cavernous Wailing's case, a sickly yellow? Ugh. Despite my visual gripes against reverb Tremor, it's really good. This special form of Tremor makes it so that every Tremor burst you do inflicts sloth damage equal to the Tremor potency on the target. And to my surprise, there was no arbitrary cap put on this, meaning if you Tremor burst an enemy at 99 Tremor potency, you get 99 sloth damage. Now I know what you're thinking. Isn't this just a worse sinking? It is. But that is a huge improvement from the state Tremor was at before, and makes it so Tremor bursts are far and away the most important thing in a Tremor ID's kit, which is why I placed such emphasis on skill 2 Tremor bursts instead of skill 3 Tremor bursts. But Tremor potency is admittedly still a very important factor that is essential in its own way, but more bursts means more damage. So, we pretty much have to drag a Hong Lu ID along, and I think the best option is easily Dieci Hong Lu. Gloom and Sloth are important Sin affinities to have, and while Dieci won't have too much Sloth generation due to you obviously using the discard trick that makes him so damn good, you have the benefit of one of the strongest IDs in the game just dealing damage on your team, so it's hard to go wrong with him. Sorry, what's that you said? Hong Lu has another Teth ego that inflicts Tremor? No, he doesn't. No, he fucking doesn't. So, with one ID locked in, the next 4 are basically no-brainers to bring. Molar Outis is an easy inclusion. Despite her tendency to go very Tremor count negative, she just has too many Tremor bursts to ignore, especially accounting for discard, and her own passive adds on some additional sloth damage, even if it's underwhelming compared to Reverb's Sloth Nuke. Her skill 2 is one of Tremor's more reliable clashing tools that comes with a burst after enough skill 1s have been discarded for self-Tremor. And the skill 3 is simply absurd amounts of sloth damage, both from the potentially 24 rolling skill itself and the 3 Tremor bursts that come along with it. Let's assume you have the coin power conditional, the enemy has 99 Tremor reverb potency on them, and your passive is active, and then you hit them. This deals 66 raw damage as a skill, as well as 357 sloth damage. Bearing in mind, the enemy will almost certainly be staggered just due to how Tremor works by default. And then the enemy can then be fatal to sloth. Yeah. Again, the main downside is the lack of tremor count on her kit, combined with her skills that absolutely chunk through it, but if you want a free tremor burst, Binds is an interesting option. This ego inflicts 6 tremor and a tremor burst on awakening, but more important is the tremor amplitude into fracture tremor, which is the red variant I briefly mentioned before. This tremor doesn't do anything special when bursted, but when the enemy is staggered, they take an additional level of stagger. This is a mechanic that is hardly talked about by anybody, really, and it makes sense why, considering it's relatively obscure, but stagger comes in 3 stages. Firstly, the one you know, the yellowish stagger. This is the default and happens when you bring an enemy's health below their stagger threshold. This leads to their damage type resistances all becoming fatal, which I'm sure you're well aware of. The second type is Stagger Plus, which is an aggressive red color and is triggered naturally by crossing 2 stagger thresholds on the same turn. This makes all damage type resistances 2.5 times more effective compared to the regular 2 times. And the last flavor of stagger is the bluish Stagger Plus Plus, which happens by crossing 3 or more stagger thresholds in one turn and leads to 3 times damage being taken from slash, pierce, and blunt attacks. All that Tremor Fracture does is make it so that Stagger will become Stagger Plus, and Stagger Plus will become Stagger Plus Plus, and no, there is no Stagger Plus Plus Plus, holy god, that's a lot of pluses. The main downside of this is using this will get rid of Tremor Reverb, and since the amplitude conversion happens before the Tremor bursts, you can't even use the massive 3 Tremor bursts on the Corrosion for the Reverb Tremor. It's especially funny since right before Frog Lu existed, Binds was a really good Tremor ego, and now, in my opinion, it's kind of an active throw if you use it once Reverb is set up, which is kind of a shame. It's still a strong way to start off a fight if you so choose, since getting the benefit from Fracture off on the initial stagger of the enemy can definitely lead to some good potential damage, but once you're in Reverb mode, you really should be committed to reverbing all the way. But okay, I've mentioned the lack of tremor count several times, and I posed some 2-star IDs that may help, but they aren't on the team. So what's our best way to maintain tremor count? Here's where Rosespanner Rodion comes in. Not within her own kit, of course, but with Effervescent Corrosion Rodion. Those who watched the Railway 3 Worst Team videos know that I gained a huge appreciation for this ego over the course of it, and here on a Tremor team full of not shit IDs, it shines even brighter. Inflicting 3 Tremor Potency and a huge +7 Tremor count while using resources that Rosespanner Rodion entirely feels herself is a massive benefit, if for nothing else than making it so you don't have to think about Tremor count management for a while after using it. This ego is practically joined at the hip with Rosespanner Rodion, which is great since she has some fantastic skills for Tremor just in her base kit. Her skill 2 with conditionals may only clash at a 14, but if you have 3+ charge and hit heads, both relatively easy conditionals, you will have a 4-coin skill rolling a 22 with a Tremor Burst at the end, while also inflicting 12 Tremor Potency. And her skill 3 is just 2 free Tremor Bursts with increased stagger threshold raising via her passive. To top it all off, she's overall tremor count positive, though just barely with her skill 1 inflicting +1 tremor count, and all of her other skills going exactly neutral. The only annoying thing with Rosespanner Rodion is to make sure that you use the skill 1 before using the skill 2, since using it without realizing you don't have 3+ charge is an experience most should try to avoid. Regret Faust is another one of those IDs that just makes sense to run, and is probably still the most important Tremor ID for Tremor teams. First of all, her skill 1 inflicts +3 tremor count, just for free, and gives herself 6 tremor count, which can be spent for attack weight, like for the skill 2, which rolls decently well, and can more than refund its own self-tremor cost when hitting 2 enemies. For our purposes, the most important part of this attack is the 5 tremor, but the plus coin drop is also pretty nice to help out someone like Rosespanner Rodion's skill 2 win a clash just that bit easier. But of course, the skill 3 is where it's really at for Regret Faust. A potential 3 attack weight skill with a whole 3 tremor bursts that don't even reduce count until the end is really good. And what's more, they all deal extra wrath damage in a similar fashion to Molar Outis. This skill's potential damage, in combination with Frog Tremor, is just silly. Let's assume we are hitting 3 targets with 99 Reverb Tremor. First of all, we are hitting 3 enemies, so that's 39, the raw damage of the skill, multiplied by 3. So a raw damage of 117. Then we add on the 9 instances of 99 sloth damage and 20 wrath damage for a total of 1,188 damage. But, of course, that is a completely unrealistic scenario, but even just assuming one target, that's 396 damage. It gets even better since Regret Faust just makes your Tremor team deal more damage in general, since via her passive, while Regret Faust is alive, which she probably will be, all Tremor bursts inflict 2 defense level down to a max of 6 defense level down total. And while I would normally go on to explain to those who don't know that defense level down is about equal to a 3% damage increase, I'll be talking about that ad nauseum with the last no-brainer ID, Oufi Heathcliff. To be honest, most of Oufi Heathcliff isn't too special, outside of the fact that he's dressed to the 9s, or I guess 11s, but there is of course the nice bit of Tremor count application on the skill 1, some actual Tremor on the skill 2, and the fact that he just deals 30% more damage pretty much innately on Tremor teams. His solid rolls with easy Tremor conditionals are also a big help. However, the main allure of Oufi Heathcliff, outside of his stunning good looks, is Decay Tremor. This was the very first different kind of Tremor we got, and it is much more interesting than Fracture, and especially Reverb, in my opinion. Decay Tremor lowers defense level by 1 for every 4 Tremor potency, meaning that at a maximum stack of 99 Decay Tremor, the enemy will lose 24 defense level. Now, that's a lot of defense level down, especially combined with Regret Faust, and even more potential sources later on. But in order to quantify just how good this is, we need to quantify it. I am deeply ashamed to present to you a math equation. This is the formula that determines how much extra damage is dealt based on the difference between offense level and defense level. Now, since we subtract these two twice in the same equation, we'll replace them with x, where x equals the difference between offense level and defense level. As I have said in several videos in the past, defense level down is about equal to 3% more damage, and while that's not wrong in smaller amounts, I said that to spare you from this. Yes, that's right, a graph. Luckily, this is a very simple graph. As we move further to the right, that is how much higher our offense level is compared to the enemy's defense level, which of course can be achieved by either raising our offense level or lowering their defense level, and I'll let you guess which one we care more about here with our Tremor team. To keep things even simpler, let's assume by default our offense level is equal to the enemy's defense level, so we start here, dealing 0% extra damage. Now let's add on that negative 30 defense level from Tremor Decay and Regret Faust. So we zoom all the way over to this point on the graph. Multiplying this by 100 shows that, as a percentage, being 30 offense level above your opponent's defense level grants you about 54% more damage against them. The returns absolutely do diminish, as you can tell, since again, the first 3 offense and defense level difference is about equal to 10% more damage, and you can feel free to plug this equation in yourself to see all the nitty-gritty and terribly nerdy numbers. Now, it should go without saying that dealing around 54% more damage to most enemies is pretty good, even if 99 Tremor certainly takes a while. And the issue is, while this is good, most times, Reverb Tremor is just going to be better. Now, there are certainly situations where Decay is superior, like if you lack Tremor bursts on your Tremor team for some reason, or if the enemy heavily resists Sloth, which is definitely the more realistic scenario of the two. Though converting Reverb Tremor into Decay Tremor isn't nearly as bad as removing Reverb for Fracture, it is still a notable downgrade in my opinion, and makes using Oufi Heathcliff's skill 3 a little bit tricky, which is a shame because it's just a good skill, even ignoring the Decay. Oh, and I guess he has binds too. This is just a good ego, so if you feel like using it, cool. It's got a free Tremor burst and a bit of Tremor potency, and conveniently happens to deal a fuck ton of damage alongside that. But now we have 5 IDs for our team. So who goes in that last slot exactly? Well, there's really only 3 options. Molar Sinclair, LCCB Ishmael, or base/Rosespanner Meursault. Molar Yisang is naturally pretty similar to Molar Outis in that they both have discard and tremor as the main focus, but Yisang, instead of greedily eating up count like a crazy person, has incredibly reliable tremor count application, a semi-consistent skill 2 tremor burst, and a double tremor burst payoff on the skill 3, with solid overall clashing due to discard leaving him with mostly only skill 2s and skill 3s if you manipulate it properly. Even better, his passive makes him inflict even more defense level down. As we talked about though, that is less valuable if you wish to run Decay Tremor due to the diminishing value. And while Molar Yisang has multiple good skills for Tremor, LCCB Ishmael has literally one use on Tremor teams. Her skill 2. And honestly, that alone is enough to justify her usage. At the cost of rolling relatively low, this skill inflicts 16 Tremor Potency and 4 Tremor Count. Meaning if you use 2 skill 2s back to back, you have 32 Tremor and 7 Tremor Count. It's honestly a little stupid how much Tremor that is, but launch IDs are known for being mixed bags. In fact, this skill is a big reason why 99 Tremor Potency isn't completely out of the question, since that's a third of the work being done by 2 uses of a single skill. As a small bonus, her skill 3 will burst Tremor, but really, and I can't believe I'm saying this, Threadspin 4 Snack Harpoon is now okay, I guess, simply on the basis of Tremor Bursts now being able to deal a lot of damage, and LCCB Ishmael doesn't really have anything better to do when she doesn't have a skill 2 or 3, so firing this off for some cheap Tremor Potency and a burst is pretty damn good, speaking from some partial experience. Lastly, the 2 Meursaults, and it's here when I can mention base Meursault's speed range once again, since him being slow is good, specifically on turns you are first converting Tremor into Reverb Tremor, since Hong Lu will always be faster than him, so you can reliably have at least one Tremor Burst happen the turn of the Tremor Amplitude. Now, is this very niche? I mean, yeah. But another benefit base Meursault has is his skill 1. No, not because of the Tremor Potency or the 2 coins, but because it is Sloth. A lot of the good ego I have mentioned really like Sloth ego resources, and if you end up using LCCB Ishmael or Rosespanner Meursault, you end up lacking it at certain times. Molar Yisang also solves this problem, of course, but I do think base Meursault is a genuinely viable budget option, assuming you have regret. And obviously, I already have talked at length about Rosespanner Meursault, and there's not much more to say about him now. So, which of these options is best? Well, after thinking on it for a while, I do have to give it to Molar Yisang. He lacks the Tremor Potency of LCCB and Rosespanner, but having Sloth generation really is deceptively important, and his Tremor Burst output is just better than the others. LCCB Ishmael and Rosespanner Meursault will still certainly serve you well, and the argument can be made that either one of them is better than Molar Yisang in certain cases, but that's just about the only wiggle room a Tremor team will allow for without losing out on too much clashing power, since removing someone like Oufi Heathcliff means winning clashes reliably becomes quite a bit harder, and we still want to function as a regular team in a game that requires you to clash. And finally, over half an hour later, that's almost all the Tremor-related stuff in Limbus. Looking at Tremor now on the whole, it still has some problems. Mostly in the fact that it is annoying to manage your skills that burst Tremor and save them for after Tremor Reverb is set up, and also the classic problem of losing a lot of value against enemies with only one stagger bar. But Cavernous Wailing gave Tremor teams a clear end goal in sight, and the main thing Tremor really needs above all right now is a Tremor Hong Lu ID. And yes, this is being recorded after the teaser image for Detective Hong Lu, so if he is Tremor, then use him. Obviously, it's not really that deep. And if he introduces a new type of Tremor, that's kind of bad, since that would compete with Reverb, but especially be sure to use him if he has a Sloth Skill 1 or Skill 2, since that would solve the Sloth issue, and probably allow LCCB Ishmael to more comfortably fill the 6th slot for accelerated potency gain. Overall, I'm really mostly satisfied with the direction Project Moon has taken Tremor. It really did start off as a weird, malformed little gremlin of a status, becoming absolutely worthless once stagger thresholds were gone, and honestly, not even that good while they were there. but slowly over time, Tremor has found its footing. With an emphasis on defense level down, increasing your base damage, and the different types of Tremor offering different potential payoffs for bursting Tremor, having high Tremor potency, or staggering the enemy, and I personally highly look forward to each and every different type of Tremor, even if it will be hard to beat out Tremor Reverb from a pure damage perspective. It's a design space with a pretty bright future in my opinion, especially if we continue to get better and better Tremor IDs that are more specialized, to the point we could eventually be building Tremor Burst teams alongside Reverb as their main Tremor type, or Decay teams that don't have as many Tremor Burstings, but large amounts of potency to lower the enemy's defense level. Of course, if this does happen, it will take a while. But I hope PM especially doesn't continually power creep the Tremor types, since then we just get a Tremor flavor of the month constantly, or just one that can never be beaten, which is far less exciting to me compared to Tremor types with varied use cases, but hey, I'm holding out hope and putting my little bit of faith left into the Tremor basket. With that, thank you for watching, and I bet you thought I was gonna forget about Suddenly One Day, huh? I bet one of you little rat bastards was getting ready to comment, "Oh, a Tremor video without Suddenly One Day? Doesn't Julian know about the fact that it can inflict 10 Tremor potency at a 20% chance?" Shut up. Anyways, with that, thank you for watching. Seriously, this time. Status videos like these are a huge undertaking, especially ones like this, or hell, Bleed is going to be a nightmare to cover when I get to it. So I hope you'll bear with me and have some patience for the future. This video ends now.